Hey, Josie.
Hello.
Hey, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to me. Um, I've been watching all of your videos and I find them all super fascinating. And so I'm super happy to just get to talk to you and pick your brain a little bit. Um, so, one of the things that I just kind of want to start with is that I just want people that don't know you who watch my channel to understand what it is you do and talk a little bit about like effects index and Psychonaut Wiki and kind of what you're up to right now.
Sure. So you want me to give a summary?
Yeah, just a little like
Okay.
summarized version.
So I am some sort of a combination of a professional internet person and psychedelic researcher working for a biotech research company. I specialize in the formal classification and documentation of altered states of consciousness for psychoactive substances in general, but most specifically psychedelics and hallucinogenic substances. I'm the founder of a few prominent projects that are well known, at least within their specific niche subculture, such as Psychonaut Wiki, which I am no longer involved in, but it's probably the thing people know me most for. The Subjective Effect Index, which is essentially just a classification system of altered states of consciousness, breaking them down into over 250 individual labels with formalized descriptions, leveling systems, image and video replications. There's also a huge community around the replication side of things, particularly on the subreddit R replications, which is where people attempt to convey what the visual and auditory aspects of hallucinogenic experiences look and sound like, usually via complex video editing, 3D modeling, art, image editing, and such. What else do I do? These days, I mean, okay, so I've been working on that project for well over a decade, kind of just as a passion project. I was always just working shitty, menial jobs while doing that on the side. And as soon as the psychedelic research industry became capitalism approved a couple of years ago, I immediately got snapped up by a company called Mind State Design Labs, which was founded by a close personal friend of Alex Shulgin. Guy who is historically significant and invented hundreds of different psychedelics, is often credited with inventing MDMA, but he didn't. He just popularized the most common synthesis for it. And now I have financial and academic backing to develop a more rigorous overhaul of the Subjective Effect Index, which I've been working on so I've been working in this company for almost 2 years now. And the thing that we are working towards is a platform that can correlate receptor affinities in the brains of specific psychedelic compounds with subjective effect outcomes. And the way we are doing that is by developing this large-scale classification system that is not publicly available yet. An older version of it is on effectindex.com, and we are taking that and merging all pre-existing classification systems, such as I'm probably all over the place right now. I have ADHD, including psychometric scales, various books, informal online projects, including wacky stuff like the DMT Nexus Hyperspace Lexicon, creating an overarching interconvertible system where all of the labels are matched up between each other, and then applying that to large data sets of trip reports for substances that have been bioassayed, so we know the receptor affinities for them, and that way we can start to draw all sorts of interesting statistical correlations. I also run a YouTube channel that showcases a lot of my subjective effect documentation work, and that seems to have blown up at some point in the last year. The algorithm favored it, I think, because DMT entities suddenly became very trendy last summer for whatever reason.
Yes. Okay, awesome. So, yeah, I think what you're doing is amazing. And to be honest, it's like pioneering. And I just think you're a brilliant person. So, I'm just so happy to talk to you.
Oh, thanks,
Um,
appreciate it.
yeah. And so, I kind of wanted to touch on some of the things you mentioned, like you're putting together this database, and I'm guessing you have some sort of system of like collecting trip reports. So I want to know how you've done this in the past, but I also wanted to bring this up because I watched your podcast with Rob from Adeptus Psychonauticus.
Oh, yeah.
And towards the end of it, you mentioned how you were compiling trip reports, but I figured we should bring that up first, since there's more chance for people to hear about it and see that if we bring it up now. So, yeah, can you talk about how you did it in the past, collecting that information, and what you're doing now?
Okay, so when I originally started the Subjective Effect Index, I was 17. I'm about to turn 30 in less than a month. Exactly a month, actually, now I look at the date. But that was based on essentially my own personal experiences and the experiences of my friends. And that is largely how the Subjective Effect Index developed. I would simply take the substances and try to break it down into individual sensory categories, and then further break those sensory categories down into subcomponents, and then break those subcomponents down into things like leveling systems and sub-effects, and I would end up with I ended up with about 250 different labels. The way that I'm doing it now is less exclusively based on my own personal experiences, because having it just based on my experiences actually implemented some biases over the years into the Subjective Effect Index, which are accounted for at this point, but that's just the nature of basing something pretty much exclusively on your own experiences.
Right.
Now I'm taking data from a number of different sources. So there's my own experience, there's my own intuition, which is pretty finely tuned for this niche subject at this point. I'm also looking, as I mentioned earlier, at different classification systems. So there's a pretty large variety of psychometric scales, like there's the Altered State of Consciousness classification system, the MEQ30, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, and these have varying degrees of quality and detail, but they're all different attempts at breaking up the psychedelic experience or altered states of consciousness in general into a similar thing, just like different classes of subjective effects. And then on top of that, I am applying the labels that I collected through that process, which was about over 500 with this new iteration of the Subjective Effect Index, which is not yet public, but will be eventually. I'm taking those labels and then I'm applying them to large data sets of trip reports, which our data scientist has scraped off of the internet. And when I come across an effect that I don't have a label for, I create a new label for it. And that's essentially how I'm doing it now. It's a mixture of different sources. I don't think any one particular approach can be all-encompassing just by itself.
Okay. So that brings another thing up that I talk to my friends about this all the time, about how the problems that come with terminology, and I think you've talked about this too on some other podcasts, like in the way that it almost becomes this sort of gatekeeping, where it's like, oh, you haven't reached level 4 ego death, then you don't really know what psychedelics are about. And it's like terminology and classification can be useful, but like, I guess talk about what some of the problems can be with that, or at least some of the difficulties. Like ego death is a big one.
I think if you're not doing it in a formal and structured way, that's where the most problems can arise. So, for example, lots of people have an idea of what ego death is, and it's completely unstandardized. So you could be saying ego death and referring to something specific, and I could be saying ego death and referring to something specific. And there are probably like 5 or 6 different things that people are commonly referring to when they use that term, but they all act like they're referring to the same thing, not realizing that it's just informal, colloquial slang. So I think that creates confusion. If you define these terms, I think that overcomes a lot of the hurdles. I'm probably biased here, but I think there's a lot more problems in not having a universal terminology set and language to discuss and describe things than there is having one. Of course, there are limitations to language. Language can never fully capture subjective experiences. It's always inherently reductive, but I think that's true with describing literally anything, and we still make an effort to do so. And I don't think psychedelics or hallucinogens are any different, really.
Right, I get that. So I wanted to also talk about this idea of unity experience. You said that it was really important to you to be able to map and describe the unity experience. So I just wanted to mention kind of a little anecdote of the thing that made me just not just a casual psychedelic enthusiast, but like a full-blown psychedelic nerd, was the experience I had when I was 18, which I would definitely say it was a unity experience where I felt like my actual consciousness was the size of the galaxies. Like there was no separation. I was it. I identified as it, and I felt contiguous with the whole of the cosmos. But at the same time, as this was unfolding, it did really feel like the old me or something within me was dying. And, you know, because I had no experience, no warnings beforehand, I wasn't into the culture or anything at that time, I had no idea what was happening. I just thought I was going to die. And I was like, well, this is it. And I'm sure a lot of people have experienced that. So
Yeah, it's very common.
So it's like a mix of, you know, because I really did feel like it was my old ego dying in that sense. But then it was also accompanied with this unity experience. So I like to refer to what I experienced as ego dissolution. Like I just melted into the rest of everything, and cosmic consciousness, just because I really did get this very like stellar celestial vibe, for this like aesthetic that was very cosmic. Could have been influenced by what I've also a big space fan, so who knows. But yeah, that's just my own experience, and I wanted to know what was so interesting about the Unity experience to you.
Okay, yeah, so I definitely think that the unity or non-dualism aspect of the psychedelic experience is probably the most profound and potentially impactful aspect of it. What you described is very common. Feeling like you're dying isn't inherent to that experience, but people very commonly interpret ego death or ego dissolution or whatever you want to call it as thinking that they are dying. So sometimes it goes as far as being a delusion accompanied with impending senses of doom that causes them to have panic attacks and stuff, but it's just very common in general. I find the Unity experience to be probably the most profound and impactful thing that I have ever personally gone through. I think I've been through it in terms of the level that you are describing, where my sense of self is expanded or applied to my entire internally stored model of reality, which for modern day humans is galaxies and space and the Big Bang and stuff. I imagine for prehistoric humans it would have been just nature or the spirit realm or whatever it was that their internal model of reality consisted of. And I imagine for religious people it often encompasses whatever their religious mythology is too. But yeah, it was just unbelievably profound. I felt like it had huge historic significance. I felt that it changed me as a person, and that if we could find a way to reliably induce such a state, that it would have incredibly significant impacts on the general society and culture of our species for the better. Alex Shulgin went as far as saying he thinks it would signal the end of the human experiment and bring on a next stage of human evolution. I try not to see these things as miracle cures. I used to think that they were when I was younger, but I don't really see them that way anymore. But I think being able to induce that state reliably would just be incredibly good for people's mental health and would have a number of knock-on effects on society as a whole.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, it makes sense that you would get excited about it after an initial experience like that, and you're like, well, if it could happen to me, why not everybody? But it turns out some people are just there's too far gone, I guess, or for a lot of people, that's also the case of psychedelics don't mesh well with them, and like mental health conditions. So the other thing that happened during my first big experience, I wanted to bring this up just because I noticed, I think it was in one of your videos. Hold on, give me 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You did an update video on your channel, and you mentioned a book that had subjective effects. And then I think you were just highlighting and making notes in a book that you had.
I have quite a lot of books like that. It might have been Antiquities of the Mind by Benny Shannon.
If I saw the video, I would be able to tell you again. But it was in one of your update videos recently. Mm-hmm. And next to the chapter title for Kundalini and the chakras, you wrote some question marks.
Oh, it was Stanislav Grof's Realms of the Human Unconscious, which was a fun read, but I have a number of problems with it.
Okay, so what's with the question marks? What does that mean?
The description was basically meaningless. It had no... I couldn't wrap my head around it. It seemed like a bunch of nonsense, and not just because it was describing things that were potentially new agey or pseudoscientific, because there were lots of other things in there that were describing things that would fit into that category. But that was just like, I literally don't understand what you were saying in this. Have you read the book yourself? Maybe you can provide some clarity for me.
No,
okay.
I knew to, but I had an experience of that, and I feel like I was in a blank slate because I really had not heard of anything like that before. And it wasn't until after the experience that I had that I looked it up and like found something. So I think it's very like a remote possibility that I had heard it somewhere between ages 0 and 18, and then maybe it had some unconscious imprint that I just like had no conscious recollection of. But to me, it seems that was one of the things that was most like confounding about it, is that I didn't have a priming or expectation for this type of experience. And when I had this unity and ego dissolution experience, it was accompanied by this sense of like energy rising through various centers of the body. So I guess what are some of the other experiences similar to that, dealing with like energy centers or things like that? Because it does sound new agey, and to be honest, when I hear a lot of people talking about it, I'm like, this sounds super silly, and I even started to doubt it myself. But then I had more experiences, so I'm like, okay, I think something's going on here. We may just not know what it is fully.
Yeah, so I haven't personally had experiences like this myself, but it does keep coming up in trip reports, to the point where I had to reluctantly make a label for it in the updated subjective effect index classification system. I just called it perception of energetic intensity, because people kept describing something like this and I didn't have a label for it. And I haven't personally been through it myself, but I do think it goes beyond just sort of cultural indoctrination isn't the right word. Cultural priming, maybe. I do think there's something universal there that human beings are just innately picking up on, that they would pick up on regardless of the culture, or they would experience regardless of the culture that they've been raised in. I don't really have an explanation for it myself, but I would personally explain it through materialistic and neurological causes if I was even going to attempt to hypothesize, but I don't think I have enough information to do so.
Sure. That's good. No, I think it's good to, like, I guess people in the scientific world tend to kind of be very dismissive and say, like, there's no there without even, opening to it. And I consider myself someone who is, I guess, like, mystic leaning. Maybe, like, if there was, like, a spectrum and you were on, like, here's the center and you're leaning towards the materialist reductionist, I'm, like, right here on the other side of the spectrum, just leaning slightly more. But I like to have a scientific mindset and be reductionist, because there is a lot of, frankly, BS like in this sphere, so it's important to be discerning and like and delusions as well. So Yeah. So, but the thing is, I've had these experiences that I've just not found a satisfying answer for. And so I saw that come up in your notes. So I was just interested about that. So I guess we'll
Yeah,
have to see. Yeah. And there could
I think
be
those are
a,
real experiences that you had.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
I think that they have causes that would occur within other human beings, regardless of culture. I do think it's worthy of analysis, but
Yeah.
I've tripped hundreds and hundreds of times, and I've tried over 200 different compounds, and it hasn't happened for me personally. So I probably just
Yeah.
don't have the right individual neurochemistry for that particular experience.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll be hoping for you one day that it happens.
Yeah. Do you have a trip report?
No, but that was actually one that I was gonna write. I made a video trip report of that, but I wanted to write it down and submit that to your repository. That
I'm
you're
always
putting
looking for
together.
Unity reports specifically if there's one going.
Okay. Have you ever dealt with? This is another thing that happened in the same trip. It was jam packed. It was action packed. It was actually the first thing that happened after I got over this sense of being like feeling like I was dying. Right. So I was like on the ground outside in a cul-de-sac. Not the best setting, but I didn't know any better. And I felt like I was dying, and I had a friend who had some experience who was our sitter. And he was like a really good friend of mine. He like grabbed my hand and held it as if I was on my deathbed, and he was like comforting me. But it was this act of compassion that actually turned the trip around and then launched it into the most beautiful direction possible. And so one of the first things that I saw was arcs of white light, like fountains going everywhere. And then eventually, at the nexus of some of these arcs of light, I saw this beautiful, what I would describe as a 3D neon alien glyph. It was like, imagine
Like a
this thing.
symbol? Is that what you mean by
Yeah.
glyph? Okay. Yep.
Yes, yes, yes. So it was like 3 feet tall, 3 dimensional, a neon green color, just a solid neon green. It was like luminescent, and it looked very like Sanskrit, Arabic, Hebrew, but it also had this kind of mathematical and geometric elegance to it that it looked very like orderly. And I had this sense that love was emanating from whatever this is. And in my tripping brain, I interpreted this as the love glue, the love energy holding together the universe. So I know that's not scientific,
Yeah.
but that's like the
It's a
impression
very
that I
common
got.
theme. It comes up a lot. Like perception of all-encompassing love is something that I've had to add to my list of mystical and transpersonal experiences. And yeah, the idea that the universe or everything or God is made of this all-encompassing love is very, very common. I don't necessarily know how to interpret that from like a philosophical perspective, but it's definitely a thing, and I think there's something there.
Right. Well, what about the specific part about the like alien language? Because I know Terrence McKenna has talked about this, like the time he took LSD and smoked DMT on the trip. He talked about this like elf language being shot all around the room, and there's also a report. Duncan Trussell talks about this like language. He was also on LSD. So this seems like the only time I've heard people talk about this alien language is from LSD, and I find that pretty interesting. But it seems like whatever it is, that's the similar kind of thing that I saw. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I have a number of thoughts on it, and they might be kind of disparate and not entirely coherent. So you said it was reminiscent of specific cultures like Arabic or Hindu. I can't remember which ones you listed specifically.
Yeah, Sanskrit mostly. Yeah, like a 3D
Okay.
Sanskrit.
Yeah. So I have this idea. So people often talk about experiencing things that to them represent Aztec or Mayan or Egyptian or Sanskrit or just like ancient languages in general. And there's often the question of, were these cultures using these substances and that inspired the way they came up with their language and their symbolism, and that's why we see it? Or do we just culturally associate those historical societies with these things, and that's why we see it when we trip? In my mind, it's probably more likely that when you are coming up with a language or a symbolism or an art style, that you are tapping into the same sort of creative neurological process that occurs both sober and while on psychedelics. And as for this language thing, I think that it's quite common to for I'm trying to think how to word this. So there's a subjective effect, just psychedelic geometry, which is just, shapes, patterns, fractals. It's often symbols, and it often feels that they convey specific neurological processes. And I personally feel that it's almost like a mental synesthesia, and the neurological signals from across the brain are crossing over into the visual cortex and being reinterpreted as complex visual stimuli that you can kind of innately read as sort of the programming or the architecture of whatever process is crossing over into your visual cortex. And I think when that happens with things like language, that you're sort of seeing the innate coding or structure within your brain that conveys or sort of runs the language models that are in our head. Essentially, there's this concept called Mentalese, which is the idea that since human brains we all have similar neurological structures, that there is kind of an innate human language that the brain runs upon, and then these culturally constructed languages are built on top of that. And I suspect that this innate human language, when it's represented in visual form, might have some sort of standardization between humans. The more I look into psychedelic experiences, although there's a lot of variety between different people, there's a lot of universality. I'm not sure if that's a real word. It's a lot more consistency than you might expect. And I think people are just kind of tapping into similar things. I hope some of that made sense or seemed relevant.
Yeah. I've heard you talk a little bit about that before, and I would agree with it. I mean, one of the first people that kind of postulated that was Alan Watts. I don't know if you've ever read his book, The Joyous Cosmology. It's his psychedelic book.
I haven't, but I've listened to a lot of his lectures and read at least one of his books. The one on Unity.
Okay, so this book is specifically about his psychedelic experiences, and his idea was pretty similar, actually. So it would be pretty crazy if you were both right, and y'all were able to just kind of intuitively get at what's going on. That this is kind of us looking under the hood of how our brain is working, and the geometry as if it's like the associative thinking, but we're able to see it and see how everything is like interlocked, interconnected. And he described it pretty well as like we're seeing how we see, and bigger than that, we're seeing just how our brain works and Mentalese and how language works, and that's so interesting. Like it's just so fascinating that we would be able to see that because of just hardcore synesthesia. Basically, we're able to just view what's going on in our brain. And there was something else that happened to me that I wonder if it's anything like this. So this is one of my most strange experiences, and it wasn't actually from psychedelics. It was from cannabis. And I had closed my eyes, and it wasn't even strong cannabis. I mean, I had a lot of it, but it was just regular, what we call like swag, dirt weed, just like old school style.
Yeah.
And I closed my eyes, and I saw what looked like a 3-dimensional model of a molecule. And I saw like it was like a 2 or 3 dodecahedron shapes, 3D, and kind of like illuminated from the inside. And then I saw like the body of a tail and some connections. And it was like I was looking at, it was like all black inside my mind's eye, but I saw this molecule spinning in 3D. And that's happened to me twice. And it makes me wonder, like, do we have some kind of innate knowledge of molecules in our head that would allow me to see something like that? Because chemistry was probably my worst subject in school, so I doubt that I would like have something totally accurate, or if that's just the imagination kind of creating art or something like that.
If I were to speculate for that experience, I don't think that the signals go as far down as individual cells or individual neurons. I think we're more seeing like the software rather than the hardware. But I think that in your head, you have a model of how these substances work, and that when you closed your eyes, you were seeing that model of how the system works, more so than like seeing the individual chemical molecules themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
that would be my interpretation of that.
Yeah. So that's something that you mentioned earlier about specific receptors and what kind of effects. Like, have you made any progress on that? Or are there any obvious ones like that you've found the 5-H2A receptor does, or anything?
Yeah, so we've pretty conclusively demonstrated that 5-HT7 is required to be in the mix for 3 umbrella terms that encompass a pretty large set of specific subjective effects, which are creative, open-eyed visuals, ego loss, and loss of contact with reality. So psychedelic substances that are more heavy on the 5-HT2 side without 5-HT7 tend not to have those things nearly as much. So we've conclusively demonstrated that correlation. It's been done a number of times now in different experiments. But what we're trying to do now is create a more precise correlational model, and that's going to require me and people that I'm training to label a pretty large data set of reports. I'm trying to do 1,000 by myself first, and I'm like over 500 in. It's pretty intensive work, but somebody's got to do it. So we're not quite there in terms of more detailed correlations yet, but I'm pretty confident that they're going to be teased out. You just need a large enough data set of totally tagged reports, essentially.
That's super fascinating. Cool. Well, I'm gonna be keeping up with your work and looking forward to whatever comes out about that. So the first time that I came across Psychonaut Wiki was actually before I took 4-HO-MET or 4-HO-MET.
Oh, and, I like 4-HO-MET.
That is, besides LSD, it may be my favorite psychedelic substance.
Really?
And what I found was that I think I read a little bit about it, and then afterwards I kind of read it again just to like compare it to my experience, and I found everything that was on the Psychonaut Wiki page for that substance was just spot on. Like the way that it kind of came in waves, where you would feel like, oh yeah, I'm totally good, like not tripping that hard. I could go to the store right now. Not that I would, but you know what I mean. Just like you feel like competent to do normal things, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm actually tripping right now. So I had a really good time with that substance and had some very, very cool synesthesia. I'll share a quick little anecdote, and then I want to hear about yours. So whenever I was tripping, I was looking at my 2 friends. They're a couple. One's a guy, one's a girl, and I was looking at their mannerisms. And as they talked, I saw like their hand gestures kind of make an imprint, as if it was like footsteps in the snow, but like in the space around them. But I saw how these imprints were like unique to them. So for example, my friend, the first one, he was like always on the computer. So it's like I could maybe this is based on what I knew about him, but it's like I saw all the space like in front of where you would put a keyboard and a mouse and like these very like geometric, like angular movements I saw for him. And then for his girlfriend, she kind of would like lean on her hip a little bit, and then I saw these like curved like lines emanate from her. So it was almost like the opposite of like, instead of straight geometric, it was like very organic and soft lines, and it almost had like a Hindu look to it, but it was like one of those the Hindu gods with all of the arms. It was like all possible movements, but I was able to see like the racetrack of where they had made those movements, and it was just really beautiful too. It was like, it's just amazing what our brain is capable of generating beauty. But so yeah, that was a cool experience, and I've done it twice, but I would like to hear about yours.
I just want to say I'm sure that the aesthetic qualities of those designs that emanated from them were genuinely based on just your vague conception of what they are like as people. Kind of ties back into this sort of neurological synesthesia concept, where your understanding of them is crossing over into your visual cortex, and you can just see that quite clearly in how things are being represented. Either that, or it could have been less of geometry synesthesia thing and more just a hallucination, which tends to be based on, I guess, the same neurological system that induces dreams and such. But even then, there were just like conceptual webs relating things to each other. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the aesthetics matched up with your understanding of them as people. But as for my experiences with For Ho Met, it's been a real mixed bag. I've had two of the most profound experiences of my life on For Ho Met, which were two Unity experiences. But I think I could have been on any psychedelic substance at the time. I don't think it was specific to For Ho Met. I had the first two times I took that substance, first time I had a high-level Unity experience, incredibly profound, became, the universe experiencing itself, blah, 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 standard stuff. And then I took it again 2 weeks later and had the same experience. Every time since then that I've tried For Ho Met, it's, I like it. It's a fun psychedelic, but it's mostly just fun to me. It induces relative to other psychedelics, a very disproportionate amount of visual effects in comparison to the cognitive disorientation. So you can be experiencing a lot of visual geometry or distortions or hallucinations, but you are less cognitively impaired than you might be if you were to get to that same level on psilocybin or pretty much any of the classical psychedelics, at least the majority of them, with a few exceptions, I suppose. Something that I also noticed is that even though the visual effects, such as geometry, were very intense, they were also, for me personally, more shallow and less intricate. It's like what it lacked in intricacy, it made up for in intensity and how much it was covering up my external environment. I also experienced a lot of what I call enhancement suppression cycles. So I go through periods of thinking like, wow, I feel like a creative genius right now. I'm coming to all these conclusions and having all these insights. And then 5 minutes later, my short-term memory would go to shit and I would lose the ability to concentrate and I'd just feel incredibly dumb and out of it. And I'd like lay down. And then 10 minutes later, I'd swing back round again. And it's like my brain was allocating resources to its cognitive faculties to a much higher extent than it usually would, and then it would go into overdrive and then be like, oh, we've gone too far, and it would collapse back down again because it couldn't sustain itself, and then it would build up again. It was like these rhythmic cycles. And for me personally, I've referred to For Ho Met as the shitpost psychedelic, because the things that I hallucinate on it are not spiritually profound, they're not unfathomably beautiful. I straight up see memes and really funny and absurd nonsensical stuff, like I'll see a face of a guy and then he'll start vomiting a torrent of bananas. Or I remember seeing like Mario Kart but with Shrek characters instead of Mario. I'm trying to just really like just random silly things, and that for me when I'm on Fort Homet would always be the encompassing theme of the hallucinations that I was experiencing when I closed my eyes. Whereas on something like psilocybin or ayahuasca, I would see things with more spiritual themes, and I like, you know, having access to that particular theme, but it's not very profound. It's more entertaining.
Oh wow, dude! I had no idea that you were seeing memes. I just want to know, like, you mentioned the Shrek and Mario Kart, but like, you saw an actual meme, or is it just like the theme of a meme?
It was like the theme of a meme. So I saw like Shrek Kart. I feel like that might have been a video game many years ago. Not that I've never played it or anything, but it was just like it was combining a character from a meme. Shrek memes are pretty in. Like back in, what was it, 2018 or something, and it was combining it with Mario Kart, or I would see very just nonsensical things. Like a friend of mine described seeing a catgirl pyramid, I think, on Fort Homet, and just stuff like that. It's like it was just tapping into what I would find funny or silly, and that was the theme for me on that drug. It seems to do that quite consistently when I take Fort Homet.
Interesting. See, mine wasn't really that silly, but I also took a smaller dose, and I felt like it could have been influenced by, you know, the energy of the room, so to speak, you know, very friendly and like loving, you know, with your friends. And the visuals were pretty beautiful. But that's so interesting that would happen to you. And do you have any speculation on, you know, based on any of your research or what you know about receptors, like why would Forho be less on the mind and more visual? Do you have any ideas of the mechanism behind that?
So Forho-Met has not been broadly assayed in terms of its receptor affinities, so it's a complete mystery. I think there are about 30 different psychedelics that have been assayed. We know the specific receptor affinities. Forho-Met is not one of them, so I could not tell you. I suspect it's very 5-HT7 heavy, considering it's inducing a lot of creative open-eyed visuals. But that is as far as my speculation could probably go. I'd be making stuff up if I went into any more detail.
Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah, that's one of the things I think is that would be such a useful compound for visual artists and musicians. I'm personally a musician, so I think it would be great because you could play music and then have this kind of intense synesthesia going along with it while still being able to kind of like not be so disoriented. So I think it could be a very useful one. I mean, all psychedelics in general, I think, catalyze creativity. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like, what is it about psychedelics besides making you want to wear colorful clothes and, you know, get droney? Like, what relationship do you think it has with creativity?
So I think there are a number of different factors at play here. So brain scans seem to demonstrate quite conclusively that the brain becomes more interconnected when you're under the influence of a psychedelic. Like different regions of the brain become connected in ways that they were not previously. Like there are charts that show pre-psilocybin, post-psilocybin, and the pre would just have specific connections here and there, and the post would be everything's connected with everything. And I think just being able to draw connections between concepts that you previously couldn't is a huge catalyst for creativity in general. I think creativity a lot of the time is you take concepts that are stored in your internal memory database and you mix and match them in your sort of internal simulation framework in an attempt to come up with something that's new and enticing and interesting. And I think that's largely what creativity is. There are other factors. For example, people have this sort of cultural filter that they interpret the world through that results in all of their biases and stuff. And when you take a psychedelic, it reduces the context that your ego places onto concepts and allows you to see them more for what they really are, with sort of a fresh state of mind without those cultural biases. And I think just seeing something from a new perspective is very powerful and can result in people having insights. And then there's more the less thoughtful aspect of it, and the way in which a psychedelic, it will do that mix and match of concepts process autonomously. Like, it will mix and match concepts and present them to you in the form of incredibly detailed hallucinations, and you'll see some pretty cool stuff, and you'll probably get inspired, particularly if you're a visual artist. So I guess there are a bunch of different factors at play. Those are the first ones that come to mind. I'm sure it's even more complex and nuanced than that, though.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a great answer, because that's all creativity fundamentally is connecting the dots. And if you can connect two dots that have never been connected, then you have something novel and new, and that's how arts evolve. And I was wondering if you have heard any reports of people on mushrooms or other describing alchemy or anything related to that.
Alchemy.
Yeah.
I don't know a great deal about alchemy. I feel like my understanding of it is probably incredibly vague. It's just, I just imagine people trying to turn mud into gold or something like that. So I certainly haven't encountered any trip reports talking specifically about that concept that come to mind. Like, how would you define alchemy and its relevance to psychedelics in this context?
Yeah, well, I'll make that my other trip report for you, where I'll talk about that. It was my Terrence style heroic dose on mushrooms, and I had no interest in alchemy. I had maybe like fallen asleep listening to a lecture of Terrence talking about it, but he comes at it through the Jungian angle. You know, Carl Jung wrote about alchemy, and he basically made the point. I don't know if I'm the best at describing this, because it's kind of nuanced and stuff, but basically the idea is not just that you're refining base elements into more pure essential forms, and like lead into gold. Yeah, that's what it's known for. But the idea was that in doing this purification process, it was also it was like your unconscious was reflecting back to you, and that in working on these materials and refining them, you were purifying your own soul through this medium. So it was also like a spiritual meditative practice for the alchemists, but maybe not all of them were doing it like that. There were definitely some grifters, you know, just trying to like make money from some kings and queens and all that. So I just had this experience on mushrooms where I saw, well, first of all, I saw like I was looking through a space telescope through the stars, and
in real life or in the hallucination?
In the hallucination,
okay.
Yeah. I was closing my eyes, and it was like I was looking through a space telescope, scanning the stars, and through my crosshairs, I was getting these little signals of red, green, and blue, which is another thing that kind of happens in some of my trips, where I'll get like the RGB. I'll see like reds, greens, and blues. So it might be something to do with my the color cones or whatever in my eyes, and then I'm like, my brain is kind of creatively spinning off of that. But anyway, I saw these stars blinking, and it was like I was getting indications of where life and biosignatures were in the universe. Because I've always been fascinated by like alien life. Is it out there? Are we going to find it? You know, following the science of like SETI and the James Webb Space Telescope. And they were actually testing the James Webb Space Telescope like a mile away from my house at this time, because I live in Houston, so I'm
so
like
it was
really
on your
close
mind.
to NASA. Yeah. And so what happened after that is, the reason I bring this up is because right after this vision, I saw what looked like an alchemist. It was like a very cartoon caricature of it, like a little Disney Merlin guy. And he was like toiling away at creating what is the end goal of alchemy is creating what's called the Philosopher's Stone, which the idea is that it is this purified form of matter that is like one and the same as your soul. It's like this representation of the human spirit, but condensed into matter. And whether that's achievable or more of like a metaphorical thing within yourself, it's something that has been a theme for me. And I saw this stone, and it looked like your own personal logo. Imagine like your own little rock that represents everything you've ever experienced, felt, and your creativity. It looked like a little logo with some colors in it, and I saw very base elements within this stone, like human tears and blood, and even snot was in there. But it was like all of this base matter was being refined into something higher and more spiritual. And then several years later, I had a vision of the alchemist stone again while doing a meditation, and it had become more refined, and basically it looked like, and the first one looked like a third grader drew it, and then the time I saw it again, it looked like it had been refined. So it makes me think that I have this kind of internal visualization of my own soul or my personality or whatever it is, but it's connected to alchemy somehow, and it's not something that I was really interested in beforehand. So yeah, I was just curious if you had heard any other experiences relating to that, because it was one of the more weird ones.
So in relation to the alchemy part, I suspect that that's because you are personally interested in alchemy, but the experience as a whole sounds highly applicable to a couple of different subjective effects. So you said when you were looking at this thing, you saw all of the details and concepts that comprise, I guess, how you conceptualize yourself as a person or a being. You said it contained, did you say it contained emotions and memories?
Not necessarily. I guess you could say it was implied in there, because it was more of the physical stuff.
Okay, so it was more implied.
Yeah, it was like the tears, the snot. But the thing is, like, I wasn't that interested in alchemy. I had heard it in passing, but it seemed like for some reason my brain during this vision had like highlighted this as something I would be interested in. But I found that interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are two specific subjective effects that come to mind for me. One of them is perception of exposure to inner mechanics of subconscious, where people feel that they are experiencing or being exposed to specific or general parts of how their subconscious mind works. For me, I interpret it more on I always interpret my brain as a computer or software running on hardware, and that's the lens that everything is channeled through. I think that's genuinely what the brain is, but because I'm very much into computers, I just sort of interpret it that way. If you're coming at it from more of a spiritual angle, I can easily see how that would have been the metaphor that your brain used to convey exposing you to hallucinatory or visual or geometric. You mentioned it was like a logo that represented. Often these geometric symbols are just sort of innately readable. They contain the structure and programming of a specific aspect of oneself, and you look upon them and you just know what it means, even if it's in an incredibly detailed fashion, like you just downloaded an entire book's worth of information from, I don't know, just looking at one symbol. So I suspect that your concept of yourself and what you are made of, it sounds like it was a lot of physiological stuff was quite prominent within this representation, was conveyed through the lens of this alchemy metaphor that even if you weren't necessarily directly interested in, at the time, it's definitely something that you're prone to being interested in, and it was a concept that was floating around in there somewhere. So I would guess that your brain was like, this is the best way to convey this thing. That's how we're going to do it. Like, I noticed that when people are into certain things, that their hallucinations seem to follow those themes. Like, people that are into science fiction get more science fiction hallucinations. People that are into fantasy get more stuff like that. People that are into new agey spiritual stuff get more of that. I was really into Lovecraftian horror growing up, so I used to get a lot of unspeakable eldritch horrors and stuff, and then it's also very computery themed. But yeah, that would be my interpretation of that experience.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. So, like,
yeah, I like analyzing people's trips.
Yeah, well, this is a great match for us then, because like I said, I consider myself more or less scientific in my pursuit of this, but it's just hard to do that all the time because of how strange and kind of out of the box these experiences can be. So it makes you wonder, like, sometimes, like Terence McKenna used to say, and we'll go more into the McKenna syndrome in a bit, but he used to say, not only is the universe stranger than you suppose, it's stranger than you can suppose. So I always like to leave some amount of open-endedness, like, yeah, it could be this, there could be a very simple answer to it, but what if there's something, maybe one out of the 10 things I experienced that is like something we just can't even imagine yet? So I just like to speculate, like, psychedelic people, we love to speculate about stuff, but we need people like Josie to ground us a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that statement. I think the human brain, if it's complex enough to produce the richness of consciousness that we experience, then it's also way too complex for us to understand it by thinking about it directly. Like, I do think there are materialist explanations for all of these experiences, but the complex processes that are going on behind them, like, I could never fathom that. And ineffability is definitely a thing.
So you mentioned having like an experience about or you mentioned that you perceive your brain as a computer. Have you ever had any like visions or experiences that were really strong with that?
Yeah, so I suppose there's this reoccurring theme when I take psychedelics, and I'm not going to sit here and say that this is definitely true, because the evidence that I have is basically my own intuition, and the drugs told me it's true. And unlike a lot of people, the drugs telling me it's true isn't enough for me to go out and say this is definitely true, even if I personally believe it. But psychedelics have always conveyed to me that the consciousness, imagination, thought, creativity are all kind of based on this simulation framework that's akin to a virtual reality video game system, that our brain takes in sensory input, and it has a neurological mechanism for separating that sensory input into concepts and labels, essentially being the same thing, and sub-concepts, and then it puts that in a memory database, and that when you're thinking about something, you are kind of simulating it in sort of your rendering framework. Like when you're, I don't know, imagining a memory, you're retrieving it from your memory database and you're simulating it. It might be highly visual. It might not be visual at all if you have aphantasia, for example. And there are like different components of this simulation framework. So the degree and detail to which it renders things can be different in different situations. So if you're just thinking about something, the level of detail wouldn't be particularly vivid, but it can kind of scale up to dreams and hallucinations that are incredibly vivid. So I think when you're dreaming or hallucinating, your brain is essentially taking concepts and rendering them into a sort of virtual reality environment that you are then exploring. And when you're thinking about things or imagining things, it's that exact same process, but at a lower degree of vividness. And there's also how controllable and autonomous it is definitely a factor. So you can sort of consciously think about things, but thoughts also very much occur spontaneously, and the same can be said with hallucinations. So you might be able to guide the hallucination to be something specific under certain circumstances, but it can also just sort of hit shuffle and render completely random concepts, often sort of with weighted tags. So for dreams, I think that the simulations that it renders are largely completely randomized, but things that have emotional significance and recency, as in something that occurred recently, are sort of weighted tags that have a higher likelihood of occurring when the situation based on concepts within your internal memory database is shuffled. And under different circumstances, there might be different weighted tags, like, for example, rendering things that are silly, hallucinatory shitposts, or rendering things that are unfathomably beautiful or unspeakable horrors or of a spiritual essence, depending on the theme that it's going for. And yeah, there's just something that keeps coming up time and time again whenever I trip, and it's kind of an explanation for how consciousness works, or how human consciousness works on sort of a software level. But I have no evidence for this. I know other people have come to very similar conclusions. I'm reading a book right now which talks about basically the exact same idea in way more detail than I've ever been able to convey. Yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind, I suppose. It's just a reoccurring theme over the years.
That's cool. I like that. I love how it's so different and uniquely tailored for everybody. So we'll wrap up here in a minute. Two things I wanted to bring up. First was what is kind of an end goal for you? And like, I know this research is probably never going to be complete in our lifetime, but do you have any kind of like final goals that you can say, yeah, we've mapped out every single subjective experience and every variation of that? Or like, what do you see as kind of your grand goal for the future?
Yeah, so it's never going to be finished, because there's always going to be more to document to a certain extent. But my goal is to create a universal terminology set that average people or researchers alike can use to discuss and describe that which was previously ineffable, that which we did not have words for beforehand, so that we can better study and understand the psychedelic experience, because we're not going to be able to understand something if we don't even have the words to describe it. So in my opinion, that should be step one. And I think developing this lexicon or terminology set or classification system or whatever you want to call it is incredibly important. I think psychedelics have profound historical significance, and it's just an absolutely crucial step in getting them to be better understood by science, better accepted by society. And I guess my goal is to have this be a sort of scientifically accepted field of phenomenology, and I would like it to be published as a universal terminology set that people can use, and kind of regardless of how you feel about the DSM. I have all sorts of mixed opinions on the DSM. I think it's going to be most analogous to that. Like, the DSM is a classification system that professionals can use to discuss and describe and diagnose mental illness. I think that something very similar needs to exist for altered states of consciousness, and that's what I'm working for. The DSM is also similar in that it's a living document. It's continuously being revised and updated as the years go by, and I suspect that the subjective effect index, especially when it gets published in a peer-reviewed journal, which is a goal that my company is working towards, is going to end up in a very similar situation. So I'll create the original version of this analogous to the DSM thing, and it will continuously be updated throughout my life. New editions will be published every however many years, and that will probably continue long after I'm dead, assuming human society doesn't crumble, which it may well.
Yeah, right. Okay, I love that. Yeah, I would like to. It's going to take collecting all this information and trip reports. So how would somebody contribute to your trip report collection?
If they want to email a trip report to me, my email is disregardeverythingIsay@gmail.com, all one word, lowercase, etc. then it will be added to the database, and I'm always looking for trip reports. So that's a great way to contribute.
Cool. I'm definitely gonna send you my big two.
Yeah,
And,
please do.
Yeah, and as we kind of see this new psychedelic reemergence and legalization push, I want to know what you see as like some of the most ideal models for integrating this into society, because there's like the therapeutic medical model, and then there's also just a recreational, but like having like a trip sitter. There's also this thing called Fireside where you can text them or talk to somebody while you're tripping. I think that's a great service. So I see those two, like recreational at home and then the therapeutic psychedelic assisted therapy, as like the two main models. But I'm wondering, like, do you in some of the original psychedelic pioneers said we need some kind of like retreat centers or like meditation centers where it can be done in a group or alone with supervision. I'm just wondering, what do you see as like the best way to go about this in the future?
So I don't think it should be explicitly you have to do it with supervision from a professional. I think that's something that is probably going to cost money, that only middle and upper class people are even going to have access to. The way that I would like to see this unfold is you start with decriminalization. I'm in Colorado, despite the British accent, and we just decriminalized all the different plant psychedelics, and we're now moving towards regulating them for medical use. And I suspect that eventually, probably more than a decade down the line, some of them will be legalized for recreational use as well. And we took a very similar path. I can't remember the specific dates, but I think Colorado...
It was like 10 years ago.
Yeah, so it decriminalized first, then it regulated them for medical use, and then eventually it legalized them for recreational use. And with psychedelics, I don't think you should just be able to go to a dispensary and buy a psychedelic as some dumb kid that just turned 21. I don't think the requirement should be particularly strict. The way I have it in my head is you should have to pass a pretty basic exam, not an especially complicated one, but you need to pass just a basic exam so that you understand basic harm reduction techniques and you know what the substance is likely to do to you, and then you can get some sort of a license to be able to buy a particular class of substances. So there might be, I mean, if we're talking about legalizing all psychoactive substances, I suspect there should be different exams for different classes of substances, so that you can't just have some dumb kid going and buying, pure crystal LSD. And yeah, I just don't think that's necessarily a good idea, although I think it would be better than the model that we have now, which is, criminalizing it.
Right. Okay, I think that's great. So, besides the Unity experience, do you have any other favorite subjective effects that are just most interesting to you?
Most interesting or most enjoyable? I guess I find the mystical experiences or transpersonal experiences to be the most interesting to me in general, because like I consider myself a materialist person, but I do have some sort of a spiritual framework. It's probably just sort of a weird modern techno twist on secular Buddhism that's quite personal to me, with some pantheism thrown in for good measure, maybe some panpsychism, why not? So I find mystical and transpersonal experiences very interesting, and those, generally speaking, are what I am drawn to, but I don't experience them very consistently, but they're always the most impactful. I've been working with Andy Newberg, he's the world's leading expert on the neurological study of religious and mystical experiences for the last year or so, and we've put a lot of work in putting together a classification system for these kinds of experiences, and that's just what I'm drawn to and what I want to learn the most about in terms of the mechanisms behind them. In terms of what I find enjoyable, I'm really into dissociatives, so I love holing. I love breaking through on dissociatives. That place is very peaceful and feels like home to me, for better or worse, sometimes for worse. Those are the first things that come to mind.
Okay. Yeah, I've actually never tried dissociative. Although I've had moments of like trance in what I feel like could be kind of a dissociative, but it was just like with cannabis. But I just like hit a certain kind of frame of mind where I would just like, I was like looking at it was like a little thing hanging off of a car mirror while we were driving, and that like put me in like a hypnosis, and I just felt this peaceful like detachment. So I know it's probably nothing like the actual, like ketamine or whatever, but what can you just describe, like, for someone who's never experienced it like me, like talk a little bit about it?
I think that dissociatives and psychedelics are kind of like a yin-yang situation, or they're two sides of the same coin. Psychedelics make your brain more interconnected, and dissociatives make your brain more disconnected. They block glutamate, which carries electrical signals between neurons. So they literally cause electrical signals in your brain to become weakened, dampened, more disconnected. And at lower levels, that starts with, I don't know, your vision becoming blurrier, your thoughts feeling more distant, your sense of touch feeling more distant. And as you ramp that up, you become increasingly disconnected or dissociated from your senses until eventually you have an out-of-body experience and you enter what people call the whole. And I think they call it the whole because it's like an expansive, dark void that you just sort of peacefully float through, and it's full of these vast hallucinatory structures that you float by, and it's incredible. They have just as much depth and impactfulness to them as psychedelics, but it's a whole other world.
Really? Okay. See, I had no idea that it was even like that. I just assumed that it was like blacking out or something. Where do you feel like you remember things less when you go into a hole?
I would say that I remember them just as much as I would remember them from psychedelics. So there's a certain amount of amnesia, but I do remember a lot of it. It's no more amnesic than a high-level psychedelic breakthrough.
Okay. And have you done anything to categorize like the type of visuals that you would come across in one of these?
Yeah, it's all in the subjective effect index on effectindex.com. I've gone as far as creating an overarching leveling system for the dissociative experience, from mild dissociation all the way up to holing, and then beyond that to ego death and blacking out. But there are different forms. It's like visual disconnection, tactile disconnection, cognitive disconnection, and it seems to be a combination of the visual and tactile disconnection that eventually causes one to separate from their body and go into hallucinatory holes that are filled with what I classify as hallucinatory structures, and then also just more general dreamlike internal hallucinations. But yeah, it's all on effectindex.com in the subjective effect index.
Cool. Yeah, I'll throw all those links in the description, and as well as your YouTube channel. So what's going on with the YouTube channel? What kind of plans do you have, or anything you're working on that you want to share?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I started the YouTube channel, when did I start it? It was early 2021, and I put a couple of videos out. They did pretty well, and then I started getting more involved in my work for Mindstate Design Labs, the company that I work for, and I realized I just didn't really have time to work on my YouTube channel, and the company was paying me, so I didn't need to pursue it as a career or anything. And eventually, sometime over the summer, my DMT entity video just suddenly blew up. The algorithm decided DMT entities were trendy, and I've started putting more work into it, and my partner has become my full-time co-writer, which has allowed me to start uploading videos, because she can write scripts for me, and then while I'm working my job, and then we can do it together, and there's time for it, essentially. So the next video that we are working on is a breakdown of the levels of intensity for DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. Not going to be able to call it DMT broken down described because it'll immediately get demonetized. But it's going to be a video on dimethyltryptamine, and it's going to be the most elaborate and longest video essay I've ever put out. And then after that, we want to focus probably on more short-term contents, short form content. So I want to focus on making videos breaking down specific visual distortions, like a video on drifting. I really want to do an in-depth cultural analysis of Hatman and Shadow People on Deliriance, because I find that really interesting. It's not psychedelic and it has no therapeutic potential, but it's just a topic I find interesting. I have kind of an endless amount of videos I want to make over the years, and I'm going to try and stick to a more regular upload schedule as my time allows for it, since I have like an actual career in psychedelic research outside of my YouTube channel already.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, you have a fan in me. I'm really just fascinated by what you're doing, and I think what you're doing is super necessary, and it's needed in this stage where we're at in this cultural moment of psychedelics coming back into acceptance, and we're gonna need some good guidance, I guess, because we don't want to fall into the trap of reactionism and charlatanism on the other side, and so we need science, basically. So really big fan of what you're doing, and I think that's a pretty good place to kind of wrap it up. And thanks for taking time out of your day to talk to me. And I'll keep in touch.
Cool, thanks. Well, great to meet you. It's been fun.
Awesome. All right, take it easy.
I'll see you around. Have a good one.